Sign it, Clara. 6 years of this performance is more than I can stomach.
Is that your final word, Jae-Min?
Sign it, Clara. 6 years of this performance is more than I can stomach. Is that your final word, Jae-Min? The check is on the table. Take your 10% and vanish. Isn't that why you drugged me that night, to reach this exact moment? I already tore it up. The settlement, don't be ridiculous. You've been counting down the days to this payout since the wedding. I returned the shares to the Kang Group treasury this morning. My resignation is on your desk. The non-disclosure is already notarized. You're lying. Nobody walks away from the Kang legacy with empty pockets. I never wanted the legacy, Jae-Min. I only wanted you to look at me once without seeing a thief. From this second on, you don't have to look at me at all. The door clicked shut. It wasn't a slam of anger or a bang of frustration. It was a soft, definitive sound, the mechanical click of a lock falling into place after 6 years of being forced open. The silence in the penthouse was sudden and deafening. Jae-Min stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the white envelope Clara had left on the mahogany table. He reached for it, his fingers surprisingly unsteady. Inside, the documents were cold to the touch. The share transfer executed. The 10% stake in Kang Group returned. The resignation letter effective immediately. Every page was marked by her signature, small, elegant, and unwavering. She hadn't taken the millions. She hadn't taken the properties. She had surrendered everything he spent 6 years accusing her of wanting. Manager Yun stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sir," he whispered, "the security gate just reported her exit. She's carrying a single suitcase. She refused the car service." Jae-Min didn't look up. 6 years of marriage, 6 years of hatred, and she had walked out into the rain with nothing but the clothes on her back. The memory hit Jae-Min with the force of a physical blow, dragging him back exactly 6 years to the morning that had defined his life. It was 4:47 a.m. at the Grand Palace Hotel. The air in the presidential suite had been thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the stale, clinical smell of industrial air conditioning. Jae-Min had woken with a skull-splitting ache, his vision swimming in the dim light of the pre-dawn shadows. Beside him, Clara Hayes had sat perfectly still, her white blouse buttoned to the throat, her hands folded in her lap as if she were waiting for a train rather than sitting in the wreckage of a reputation. He had been furious then, a blind, white-hot rage that scorched away any logic. He remembered the way he had loomed over her, accusing her of slipping something into his drink at the corporate gala, of being the mastermind behind the sudden, frantic pounding at the door. Then came the flashbulbs. The explosion of light had been violent. The doors had burst open not to security, but to a coordinated phalanx of paparazzi. The shutter clicks sounded like a hail of gunfire in the small room. He remembered the grainy, high-contrast photos that would dominate the headlines within the hour, the powerful air of Kang Group caught in a compromising dawn with a mere intern. Clara hadn't screamed. She hadn't hidden her face or reached for a blanket to cover herself. She had looked directly into the lenses with a terrifying, hollow calm. While Jae-Min had roared at the security team and tried to shield his face, Clara had stood up, smoothed the wrinkles in her professional skirt, and looked at him. "Done, Jae-Min," she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the shouting of reporters. "The trap has already snapped shut." He had interpreted her words as a victory lap. He thought she was telling him that she had won, that the trap was her successful ascent into the Kang family. He didn't see the way her hands were shaking beneath the table. He didn't notice that she was looking at the door with the expression of someone who had just walked into a cage to keep someone else from being caught in it. By 8:00 a.m., the stock price of Kang Group was in a freefall. By noon, his grandfather had summoned him to the ancestral estate. The narrative was set in stone, a scandal that could only be cured by a contract. Jae-Min had looked at Clara across the mahogany boardroom table later that day and seen only a predator. He had promised himself that for the next 6 years, he would make her regret every second of the life she had stolen. Standing now in his empty penthouse, Jae-Min realized he was the one who had been caught in a trap of his own making, one built of pride, fueled by a single morning of grainy photos and a truth he had been too arrogant to see. The ancestral estate of the Kang family was a place where silence was used as a weapon, and that afternoon, The air was sharp with it. Jae-Min sat across from his grandfather, Chairman Kang, in a study that smelled of old parchment and cold ambition. On the television mounted to the wall, the grainy image of Clara Hayes leaving the Grand Palace Hotel played on a loop, a digital stain on a 60-year legacy. "The board is already meeting," the chairman began, his voice like dry leaves skittering over stone. He didn't look at the screen. He looked only at Jae-Min, his gaze weighing his grandson's worth and finding it wanting. "The virtuous heir narrative is dead. By morning, the creditors will be circling. You didn't just stumble into a hotel room, Jae-Min, you stumbled into a coup." Jae-Min gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "It was a setup. The girl, she must have been paid. I'll find out who she's working for, and it doesn't matter who she is working for," the chairman interrupted, cutting through the protest with surgical precision. "What matters is the optics of the aftermath. If you cast her out now, you are a predator who took advantage of an intern. The Kang Group will be dismantled by HR lawsuits and public outrage before the week is out. But if you marry her," the old man paused, a slow, predatory smile forming. "If you marry her, it's a whirlwind romance. A lapse in judgment, yes, but one born of passion. We turn a scandal into a sacrifice." "I won't do it," Jae-Min hissed. "I won't tie myself to a social climber who drugged me." The chairman stood, leaning heavily on his cane as he walked toward the window. "Then you will walk out of this house with nothing. I will initiate the succession protocols for your second uncle. By sunset, your access to every account, every office, and every asset of the Kang Group will be revoked. You will be the man who destroyed a dynasty for the sake of his pride." The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jae-Min thought of the years he had spent clawing his way to the top, the sacrifices he had made to prove he was the rightful heir. To lose it all to a girl who had likely been bought for the price of a cheap sedan was unthinkable. 6 years, the chairman said. Not turning around. A contract of 6 years. You will provide for her, you will present a united front, and you will keep your hatred behind closed doors. At the end of that term, she receives 10% of the holding shares as a settlement, a clean break, a business transaction. Jae-Min looked at the contract already resting on the desk, waiting for his signature. He felt the cage doors swinging shut, the same way they had for Clara in that hotel room. He picked up the pen, his heart a cold, dead weight in his chest. He would sign, but he would make sure that for the next 2,190 days, Clara Hayes lived in a world as frozen and unforgiving as the one his grandfather had just created for him. The east wing of the Kang estate became a monument to silence. For 6 years, it was a sprawling, high-ceilinged cage where the only sounds were the hollow echo of footsteps on marble and the occasional, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that seemed to be counting down the sentence they were both serving. Jae-Min ensured they lived as parallel lines that never touched. He moved their lives into a rigid schedule of avoidance. He left for the office before the sun touched the garden and returned long after the staff had retired. When they were forced to share a meal for the sake of the housekeepers, he never looked up from his tablet. To him, Clara was a ghost he had accidentally conjured, a reminder of a moment of weakness he couldn't forgive. He watched her from the periphery of his vision, looking for the cracks in her composure. He was certain that, eventually, the intern from nowhere would slip up. He expected her to start asking for jewelry, for a dedicated driver, or for a seat on the foundation board. He waited for her to flaunt her new status to the friends she must have left behind in the cramped apartment he imagined she came from. In his mind, her background was a void of ambition, and this marriage was her greatest achievement, a strategic heist of a life she hadn't earned. "How much did they promise you?" he had asked her once, 3 months into the first year. They were standing in the foyer, the air between them frigid. "The people who put you in that hotel room. Whatever they paid, I hope it was worth the 6 years of looking at a man who despises you." Clara had been adjusting a vase of white roses on the console table. She didn't flinch, she didn't even stop her task. "Nobody paid me, Jae-Min," she said softly, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. "Don't lie. A girl with your bank balance doesn't just happen to be in the presidential suite of the Grand Palace at 4:00 a.m. You saw an opening to escape your life and you took it. She finally turned to look at him, her dark eyes unreadable. You're right about one thing. I did see an opening, but it wasn't an escape for me. He had laughed then, a short, ugly sound. He took her calm for arrogance and her silence for a confession of guilt. He didn't see the way she spent her evenings in the library, not reading fashion magazines, but poring over the company's quarterly ledgers with a highlighter and a grim expression. He didn't notice that she never spent a cent of the allowance his grandfather provided, the black card he'd tossed at her sitting untouched in a velvet-lined drawer. To Jae-Min, she was simply the nobody who had stolen his freedom, and he was determined to make her feel the weight of that theft every single day. While Jae-Min slept the heavy, restless sleep of a man burdened by the crown he wore, the East Wing flickered to life with a different kind of industry. Clara didn't spend her nights mourning the husband who treated her like an unwanted ghost. She spent them at a mahogany desk, the glow of an encrypted laptop illuminating a face set in lines of sharp, professional focus. The Kang Group was a fortress, but even fortresses have cracks, leaks in the foundation that Jae-Min was too distracted by the board's politics to notice. For months, Clara had been tracking the quiet hemorrhaging of assets from the logistics division. She saw the patterns he missed, the slight inflation in shipping costs, the ghost vendors, and the systematic sabotage of the Haesung Logistics deal, a contract that represented the future of the company's supply chain. She worked with a silent, surgical precision. She didn't have a title, an office, or an official login, but she had the institutional knowledge of an intern who had once been the brightest mind in the research department before a scandal derailed her trajectory. Using an offshore server to mask her digital footprint, Clara began to intercept the sabotage. She stayed up until the blue light of dawn, rerouting supply chain data and tightening security protocols that had been intentionally left porous by Jae-Min's rivals. When the Haesung deal finally landed on Jae-Min's desk, it arrived as a gift-wrapped miracle. The complex logistics errors that had plagued the proposal for weeks had suddenly vanished, replaced by a streamlined strategy that was as elegant as it was profitable. Jae-Min sat in his high-backed leather chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. It was the break he needed to silence the board, a masterstroke of corporate strategy that appeared to have fixed itself overnight. The analytics department really outdid themselves this time, he remarked to manager Yun, his voice carrying a rare note of triumph. Yun, who had seen a light burning in the East Wing at 3:00 a.m., remained silent. He watched as Jae-Min took the credit, signed the papers, and felt the weight of his position stabilize. Jae-Min attributed the success to his own leadership, convinced that his strategic patience was finally paying off. He never looked toward the hallway where Clara stood, coffee in hand, her eyes tired but her expression unchanged. She didn't need the credit and she didn't need his thanks. She simply watched him reclaim his power, knowing that as long as he stayed at the top, the people who had tried to destroy them both in that hotel room would remain in the shadows. She was the shadow manager of his empire, ensuring the king kept his throne even while he dreamed of the day he could finally cast her aside. The annual Kang Group Founders Gala was a sea of shimmering silk and sharp-edged smiles, a place where social status was measured by the depth of one's lineage. Jae-Min moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his presence commanding, yet he remained acutely aware of Clara standing a few paces behind him. She was dressed in a simple, floor-length gown of midnight blue, elegant, yet intentionally understated, as if she were trying to blend into the shadows of the ballroom. It didn't take long for the predator to circle. Elena Choi, the daughter of a rival shipping magnate, and the woman the board had originally envisioned for Jae-Min, stepped forward. Her glass of champagne caught the light like a weapon. "Clara, dear." Elena's voice carried just far enough to turn heads. "I was just telling the senator how remarkable it is to go from filing papers in the basement to hosting the Founders Gala in just 6 years. It's the ultimate rags to riches story, isn't it? Or perhaps just a very lucky night in a hotel." A cold ripple of laughter moved through the nearby circle of socialites. Jae-Min felt a familiar spike of irritation, though he wasn't sure if it was directed at Alina for her lack of class or at Clara for being an easy target. He waited for Clara to falter, to flush with shame, or to offer a stuttering defense that would prove she didn't belong in this world. Instead, Clara shifted her gaze toward Alina. Her expression didn't change, her brow didn't furrow. She looked at the heiress with a calm, analytical detachment that was unnerving. "Luck is a factor in everyone's life, Alina," Clara replied, her voice smooth and devoid of heat. "But I've found that the Kang family values results over origin stories. If you're interested in the logistics of how I manage my time, I'd be happy to send you the quarterly efficiency reports. I noticed your father's firm struggled with the Haesung transition last month. Perhaps a little more focus on the basement work would have helped." The silence that followed was absolute. Alina's smile twitched, her face blooming into a frustrated crimson. She had come prepared for a catfight, but she had been met with a brick wall of corporate steel. Clara didn't wait for a rebuttal. She gave a slight, polite nod and turned back to a passing waiter, taking a glass of sparkling water as if the confrontation had never happened. Jae-Min watched her, a strange, uncomfortable sensation tightening in his chest. He had spent 6 years trying to break her spirit with silence, and Alina had just tried to break it with scandal, yet Clara remained untouched. She was unbreakable, not because she was arrogant, but because she seemed to be operating on a level of reality that none of them could touch. For the first time, Jae-Min wondered if his hatred hadn't been a burden to her at all. Perhaps it was just another noise she had learned to filter out. The summer air at the Kang family's weekend villa was thick with humidity, and the sound of a distant, churning storm. Jae-Min was inside the glass-walled study, his attention divided between a global shipping crisis and the sight of his younger sister, Jae-In, laughing by the edge of the infinity pool. Jae-In was the only person in the family who treated the estate like a home rather than a boardroom, and Jae-Min's protective streak for her was the only soft edge he had left. The incident happened in a blur of fractured light. A stray electrical wire, loosened by the previous night's wind, had snaked across the wet tiles near the pool's filtration intake. Jae-In, distracted by her phone, stepped toward the shimmering water, her bare foot inches from the live current. Jae-Min lunged for the door, but he was too far. He saw Clara move first. She didn't scream or call out. She simply threw herself forward, her body a physical barrier. She intercepted Jae-In with a forceful shove that sent the girl tumbling onto the grass, safe and dry. In the momentum, Clara's own arm struck the heavy iron base of a poolside sculpture with a sickening, muffled crack. Her hand swept through the puddle near the wire, and for a terrifying second her body jerked with the shock before the circuit breaker finally tripped, plunging the garden into a sudden, eerie silence. By the time Jae-Min reached them, Clara was already standing. She was pale, her breath coming in shallow hitches, but she was helping a confused and sobbing Jae-In to her feet. "Are you hurt?" Jae-Min demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of terror for his sister and his habitual suspicion. He looked at Clara, searching for the drama he expected from her, the tears, the grasping for attention, the demand for a doctor to witness her heroism. Clara tucked her right hand into the pocket of her cardigan, her movements stiff. "She's just startled," Clara said quietly, nodding toward Jae-In. "Check her knees. She scraped them on the grass." "I asked if you were hurt," he repeated, his eyes narrowing. "I'm fine, Jae-Min. It was just a slip." She walked past him into the house, her gait steady despite the cold sweat on her brow. Later that evening, Jae-Min saw her at the dinner table, using only her left hand to push her salad around the plate. When he caught her eye, she didn't wince or offer an explanation. She remained the same inscrutable presence she had been for years. He convinced himself it was just another calculated move, that she was playing a long game of stoicism to make him feel guilty. He didn't know that upstairs, in the privacy of her bathroom, Clara was wrapping a makeshift splint around a hand that had turned a dark, swollen purple, biting back the pain so she wouldn't have to hear him call her sacrifice a performance. 3 days after Clara's departure, the silence in Jae-Min's office felt heavier than it ever had in the East Wing. He was obsessively reviewing the files she had left behind, the clean audits, the saved contracts, when a man named Detective Park was ushered in. Park was a retired investigator for the Kang Group, a man who had made a career out of finding the dirt others tried to bury. "I heard the contract ended," Park said, placing a weathered manila folder on the mahogany desk. "I thought you might finally want to see what was in here. I tried to give it to you 6 years ago, but you were too busy convinced you'd been hunted." Jae-Min opened the file. Inside were records not from the hotel night, but from the months leading up to it. There were transcripts of intercepted calls and photographs of shadowy meetings. "Before that night at the Grand Palace," Park explained, "your second uncle approached 3 different interns. He was looking for a wedge to drive into your succession. The first 2 took the bribe immediately, but the third one—" Park tapped a photo of a younger Clara, her expression as serious then as it was the day she walked out. "She didn't just say no. She threatened to go to the chairman. Your uncle realized he couldn't buy her, so he decided to break her instead. He knew if he staged a scandal, you'd do the rest of the work for him. He knew your pride would turn you into her jailer." Jae-Min felt a cold hollow opening in his chest. "She could have told me." "She did in her own way," Park replied, his voice tinged with a weary pity. "But you only listen to people you think are your equals, Jae-Min. You saw a girl from a nobody background and assumed she had a price because everyone else in your circle does. I watched her for 6 years. I saw the rival firms offer her millions to leak your supply chain data. I saw the press offer her a fortune for a tell-all interview. Every time the answer was the same, an absolute, unbreakable refusal." The detective stood to leave, pausing at the door. "She didn't stay for the 10%, kid. She stayed because she knew if she left, your uncle would just find someone who could be bought. She was the only thing standing between you and a board of directors that wanted you gone. She protected you from a betrayal you were too arrogant to even notice." Jae-Min stared at the grainy photos of Clara. For 6 years, he had treated her like a mercenary, never realizing that the only person in his life who couldn't be corrupted was the one he had spent every day trying to ruin. The digital archive of the Grand Palace Hotel was a graveyard of secrets, but the file Jae-Min now held was the one he had been too terrified to look for. It was the unedited, raw feed from the hallway of the presidential suite, time-stamped 6 years ago at 3:12 a.m. In the grainy black and white footage, Jae-Min saw himself first. He was stumbling, his arm draped over the shoulder of a man he now recognized as his uncle's driver. He looked incoherent, his head lolling, clearly drugged, just as he had always claimed. The driver dumped him into the room and retreated, but the door didn't click shut. It remained slightly ajar, a silent invitation for the paparazzi already waiting in the service elevator. Then Clara appeared. She wasn't being led, she was running. She reached the door and stopped, her chest heaving as she looked at the cracked frame. She looked down the hallway toward the elevators where the red light of a camera was already visible. In that moment, the footage captured something Jae-Min had never seen. Her face wasn't one of triumph, but of agonizing realization. She looked at the door, then back at the approaching shadows of the reporters, and she froze. Jae-Min watched his own breath hitch as he saw what she did next. Clara didn't run away. She didn't call for help that would never arrive in time. She reached out, gripped the handle, and stepped inside the room, pulling the door shut behind her. He switched to the internal suite camera. The room was dark, but the infrared light caught her clearly. She didn't climb into the bed. She sat in the armchair across from where he lay unconscious, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles looked like white stones. She sat there. For an hour in the dark, watching the door, her eyes wide and wet with tears she refused to let fall. She knew exactly what would happen when the sun rose. She knew that by being found there, her career was over, her name would be dragged through the mud, and she would be bound to a man who would likely hate her for it. She had chosen to be the scandal so he wouldn't be the victim. She had walked into the cage to ensure that when the lights went up, he had a wife instead of a predatory heir headline. Jae-Min leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in eyes that were finally, belatedly, stinging. He remembered the way he had screamed at her that morning. He remembered the 6 years of coldness he had used to punish her for a crime she had committed to save him. The CCTV didn't show a social climber. It showed a soldier standing guard over a man who was too blind to realize he was being protected. He had spent 6 years looking for a motive, never realizing the motive was simply him. The penthouse was a hollow shell of glass and steel, stripped of the only warmth it had ever known. Jae-Min wandered into the kitchen, a space he had rarely entered, fueled by a desperate need to find a trace of her that wasn't a legal document or a grainy video. He pulled open the small utility drawer near the stove, and there it was, a pale blue notebook with frayed edges, its cover worn smooth by years of use. He opened it, expecting to find a diary or perhaps a list of grievances. Instead, he found an archive of his own life, curated by the woman he had treated as a ghost. The first page was dated 6 years ago, the week they moved in. It wasn't a record of her feelings, but a manual for his well-being. Jae-Min's migraines usually start behind the left eye. He won't admit it, but he needs the blackout curtains drawn and the peppermint oil from the third shelf. Do not offer him water. He prefers ice chips. He turned the pages, his heart fracturing with every line. There were 2,190 days recorded in that book. She had documented the exact temperature he liked his morning coffee when he was stressed. She had noted the names of the children of his most difficult board members, so he would never forget to ask after them during tense negotiations. She had even written down a list of his father's favorite jazz records with a note, "Play these on the anniversary of his passing. Jae-Min will be quiet that day. Just leave the room open and the fire lit." The most recent entry was from the night before she signed the papers. There were no tears on the page, just her steady, precise handwriting. "The winter coats are back from the cleaners. I've moved the gray wool one to the front because the forecast says it will drop below freezing on Tuesday. Your vitamin levels were low in the last physical. I've hidden the supplements in the top cabinet behind the tea. Please remember to eat. You forget when you're winning." Jae-Min slumped against the counter, the notebook clutched to his chest. He realized then that while he had been spending 6 years looking for a way out of his marriage, Clara had spent every single hour of those 6 years building a world that would support him. He had looked at her and seen a social climber, while she had looked at him and seen a man so lonely he didn't even know how to take care of himself. She hadn't just protected his company or his reputation. She had protected his very existence, asking for nothing, not even a thank you. He was the most powerful man in the city, the head of a global empire, yet he was standing in a silent kitchen, realizing he didn't even know how to find his own vitamins without the woman he had driven away. She was gone, and for the first time in 2,190 days, Jae-Min was truly alone.